I suppose I started drawing as most kids do, simply playing with crayons and markers. I had access, perhaps, to some things that other kids didn't, in that I had a father who also drew. So there was always paper lying around, there was always something that I could use to make a mark upon the page. I grew up mostly in California, but I lived in Texas and England for the time before that. But to be honest, I don't remember those times. When I talked to my mother about those early years, I called 15 to 20 different places home before we finally settled. And this had a dramatic impact on me. I have, to this very day, a desire to stay home that pervades almost everything I do. When friends want to go out and see a movie or do something, it's always fighting against this urge in me to stay home, to stay in a place that is safe, that is ever trying to recover something that I didn't have in those early formative years of my life. But I wasn't upset about it so much. After all, home was where my things were, and among those things were my art supplies. And so I drew, and painted probably, though I don't have any early memories of paintings, only a couple watercolors that my mother has kept from those days. But something profound in those early years to me was watching my father work, or rather, was seeing his artworks. I grew up in Northern California on an Air Force base. My dad flew the U-2, which is a spy plane. And he spent a lot of his time after we returned from England when he was flying in the Middle East. He spent a lot of time flying in Asia. And so he was gone for large portions of the year. And I think for him, he felt guilty about not being there for so much of my youth. Now, to be honest, I don't really bear any scars from that because I grew up in a world where that was what everyone's father did. So it didn't seem strange. I have no memories of feeling resentment or animosity toward my father because he was gone so much. But I think he might have felt guilty about it sometimes. And he would bring back from those trips to Laos and Cambodia, to Korea, drawings from his time when he wasn't flying, where he would go sit in those tropical jungles. And he would try on Bristol paper with ink and pens to capture the wildlife and the animals that lived there. I think sometimes he would come back and he would get books like the old eyewitness books that had so many pictures of the animals that he would run into on these journeys, and he would use those to draw. But of course, when I was little, I didn't know that. I just assumed my father was sitting out in the jungle and drawing salamanders and giant rhinoceros beetles and toucans and things like that. But it didn't really matter, even once I figured out that he was probably using references that he found around the home. It felt magical. It was this wonderful, beautiful thing that he brought back to me from his journeys and his travels. And that inspired me in a way to make my own things, to contribute in some way to the stories that I brought forth in my artwork. There was another thing that my father did in my youth that really began to show up in my artwork in middle school and high school and is incredibly prevalent today. When most parents of young children, myself included, put their kids to bed, it's pretty common to read your kids a story. My father, on the other hand, for whatever reason, decided he would not do that, that he would make up stories. So, being a fan of classical fantasy and science fiction, he crafted stories about dwarves and trolls and elves and dragons, and he would tell me stories about these characters at night before bed instead of reading me a story. Each night he would come in, he would ask me what we talked about the prior night. I would fill him in excitedly on what these characters were doing, and he would pick up the story. Now, I don't know if he planned it all, if he had a notebook somewhere. I kind of don't think so. It's not really how my father works and operates. My guess is he was letting me tell him what I remembered from the night prior, whether it was true or not, and then he was running with that. And he was coming up with random details and cool things. I would wager that as these stories unfolded over weeks and months, he probably did have some idea of where the story might be going, but that inspired a little Zach that stories are innate in what it is to be human, that telling stories is one of the best ways we can communicate ethics and morals, beliefs, and important things of what it is to be human. And of course, we as people know this. Most of our oral traditions, including the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Bible, these were oral traditions, stories that were handed down probably around a big bonfire at night for eons before they were ever written down. This is a very innately human thing. And I just had the fortune of running into it as a small child. So I was inspired by the artwork that he brought home and by the stories that he told me. Of course, as I started kindergarten and first and second grade, I drew all the time. I struggled in classes to pay attention in the way that most teachers wanted me to. I can pay attention pretty well while I take notes, while I draw, while I do other things. Probably a touch of undiagnosed ADHD as a child. But to be fair, 30 some odd years ago, it wasn't as common to take a look at kids and diagnose them. And frankly, I'm not sure that I would have had anything done differently than the way that I had it initially. But I ran into some struggles with that, where teachers would bear down on me, ask me to stop fidgeting, to stop drawing, think that I was being disrespectful, even though I could answer their questions and could perform proficiently when I was put on the spot. But I kind of became known as the drawing kid, the art kid, even in those early years. It was something that was encouraged at home, and so I was always able to do it with some peace of mind, even if the teachers felt like it was a strange or disrespectful thing. And then I discovered video games. It should be said here that my dad is a little bit of a nerd. Whether this story is true or not, I am not 100% sure. But I have heard the story that my father actually took my mother to an old game arcade for one of their first dates. Back then, people didn't play video games at home very much. The consoles and the arcade systems were quite expensive. So there were actually places that people would go out and would play these. And I guess my father took my mother on a date to one of those. They also went and saw the first Star Wars movie together in theaters. And my dad was always a huge fan of science fiction and fantasy. So even way back in the day, my dad was always playing video games. And probably as an excuse to get the systems, the original Nintendo, for example, into the house, he let me play those things, and it became a bonding thing for me and for him. The original Nintendo was pretty brutal. I was young, and the games were quite difficult. I loved the old Mega Man games, but in the original versions of those games, you could only have 3 of the bullets on the screen at a time, and that made it a little bit difficult. And it also meant that if you got right up on the boss, you could cheese them, because you could just shoot forever, essentially. But when the Super Nintendo came out, that was really when I was old enough to enjoy it and to really sink my teeth into those games. But the most exciting thing about those games for me as an artist was the fact that each of them came with a little art booklet. And in that art booklet was wonderful examples of Samus and Kraid and Ridley and the Zebesians. We actually got Donkey Kong Country on release. And early, prior to its release, we got a VHS tape of the process of them developing the game, because we were that big of nerds way back in the day. And that game, again, also came with an art book for all these characters, for King K. Rool and the Claptraps and all of the interesting characters. And so, of course, I copied all of them. I loved them. I never had a Sega Genesis, but I had a friend on the Air Force base who did, and we played Sonic the Hedgehog. And Sonic was such a fun character to draw, such a fun character to work from. The Mega Man games continued, and I got Mega Man X for the Super Nintendo. And what a wonderful game that was. And I have been drawing little robots since. They show up even now in my artwork and in my sketchbook sessions, largely because of that. But my father, being the nerd that he was an early adopter of the internet. We had AOL dial-up way back in the day, and my father was playing the original Mech Warrior games and Command and Conquer and Total Annihilation online. So I had a chance to play things like Mech Warrior and Command and Conquer and Total Annihilation, these lovely games that exposed me to science fiction things really for the first time. And it was so much fun. And of course, I built mechs out of my Legos and I drew Mech Warrior stuff. And I still have one of the instruction booklets from Mech Warrior 3 or 4. But those video games were not only just a ridiculously fun thing for me to spend time doing, but they also showed me what art could be. And this is me at a pretty young age. I'm probably 6, 7, 8 years old now, but I just had so much fun drawing these things from these little booklets. And back then, there really wasn't an internet to go look on. I mean, it was in its infant stages, but you couldn't Google images for things. Google didn't exist. At least it didn't exist that I was aware of. Somebody can Google that date for me down in the comments below if you would like to. Art became inextricably tied to those video games. They were my largest influence at that point in time, and I loved them. About this time, my brother was born, and he was famously in love with watching us play video games. In fact, he would try to wake us up sometimes in the middle of the night to play Command and Conquer. He continues to enjoy video games to this day. It was about this time that I got a hold of what would become one of my favorite books ever, which was J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. I was in 4th grade when I read it the first time, and I loved it. I fell in love with it. And for many years after that, it was my go-to book anytime I was on a plane, which was a lot because living out in California and the rest of our family lived in Ohio, we flew back multiple times a year just to touch base over Christmas break or summer break or things like that. So I read The Hobbit every single time I was on one of those planes and became extremely proficient in Hobbit lore, even though I was only about 8 or 9 years old at the time. And of course, that influenced a lot of the art that I made and a lot of the stories that I wanted to tell, and was building directly on the stories that my father had told me when I was younger. After 4th grade, my dad got out of the Air Force and we moved to Colorado, which is where we still live today. I started 5th grade the summer after we moved here, and it was strange. I had had many instances of people coming and going from my life growing up in the military, but there was always kind of this understanding that everyone came and went, and so we made friends really, really quickly and really easily. Moving to Colorado and starting the last year of elementary school with a group of kids who presumably had been there since kindergarten, I did not fit in. I made basically 0 friends that entire year, and it was a struggle. My teacher, my homeroom teacher, I still remember talking to my mom and just being so frustrated with me. And frustrated because I didn't listen unless I understood the reason or the meaning behind the thing, and because I exhibited a lot of traits of what would be a trouble student, except I was really academically proficient. In fact, I ran into a rather strange problem in my math class because after a few weeks, my math teacher realized that I knew everything he was going to teach that entire year. I had spent the year prior in a private school, and the year before that, I had been homeschooled. My schooling situation was a little odd in my youth. Instead of just sitting in the class and following along with things that I already knew, that math teacher introduced me to perspective drawing and to some mathematics-based drawing. And so I got to spend that entire year working on drawing in my math class. I did have an art class at that school, and it might have actually been the same teacher that I then student taught with many, many years later, though neither of us was 100% sure that that was the case. This was good, though, because a lot of the art classes that I had had prior were not very serious. And so for the first time, I was in a normal, standard public school with a teacher who was educated in teaching art. So I don't remember a whole lot from that year, but that's probably a good thing because most of my memory from that portion of my life is the things that were difficult. And so the fact that I don't remember a whole lot of my art class in 5th grade likely means that it was all right, that it was decent. I ended up going to a private Christian school for middle school, though, for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And one of the deficiencies of that school was that they had no art classes. And this wasn't really a bother for me. I had already started working through sketchbooks like a fiend. I even have some of my 6th and 7th grade sketchbook tours here on this channel, though I don't assume that I have every single sketchbook that I've ever used, because I'm sure some fell by the wayside, especially moving from California to Colorado. But I became known quickly in that 30 student class as the art kid. Just weren't a lot of other people in that class that were working as artists. I mean, they all drew in some capacity. You have a lot of 6th graders who were just going to draw for fun, but I seemed to be the one that was the most proficient. And of course, as a 12-year-old who's coming into a new social circle, again, of kids who had been in school with each other since kindergarten, anything I could do to fit in was lovely. And fitting in was very difficult. I found out through my mother about halfway through that school year that I was the only student who was being excluded from all the birthday parties. That these parents who had had their kids together since they were kindergarteners had just decided they weren't going to include the new kid who had come in 6th grade. And this was hard for me. Social stuff was hard for me. It took a while for me to kind of wrap my head around social dynamics. And for most kids, that happens in about 3rd or 4th grade, and I was a late bloomer. It took me a lot of time to figure out how to interact in a way that was socially appropriate, what level of bluntness or joking worked. Those things were very hard for me. And middle school, for this reason, was quite difficult. So I leaned into being the art kid. And eventually I became known as the guitar kid as well, because I started taking guitar lessons in my 6th grade year. My mom and my dad forced me to do it for the first 6 months, and then eventually I fell in love, and it continues to be a huge part of my life today. I still write songs frequently. I probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 120 songs written. I played in punk rock and ska bands for most of high school and a teeny bit of college, and eventually moved more onto progressive and metal, but nowadays I just write for myself. And I probably will open up another channel at some point that will be focused specifically on music, especially focused on the concept albums that I work on now. But that was another thing that gave me a little bit of a tether in middle school. I was the art kid and I was the music kid. And then I met this boy at my guitar lesson place, and he was very interesting. He had a lot of the same interests that I did in fantasy and sci-fi and video games, and we would just kind of chat for a few minutes at the end of my guitar lesson at the beginning of his. Lo and behold, he ended up enrolling in the same little private Christian school that I was in 8th grade. He started there. And I learned very quickly that he was also an art kid. And he was much, much better than I was. For a time, this made me really uncomfortable because this was the niche that I filled. This was the role that I had. And all of a sudden, here's a kid who could do awesome portraits of things from his mind and could make funny versions of the other kids in the class. And he did all these things that I could not do. And for a time, I was very jealous. But fortunately, I had already met him. I already had a little bit of a relationship with him. And we ended up becoming good friends, not only for that last year of middle school, but for the entirety of our time in high school. And even for a little while afterwards. He actually helped me buy my first computer after I got married and had graduated college because he was working at the Apple store at the time. So he's a lovely human being, and I really hope that I can reconnect with him in the next couple months or years because I miss him. And I miss his stories. And that's the big thing that he brought into my life, is he was a world builder. He had this massive science fiction story built out in his mind and in numerous sketchbooks. He was a big fan of Warhammer 40K. He played the Chaos Space Marines. And he had all these awesome little figures that he had drawn on. And he played guitar, and he had this old, cool Fender Bronco that was original. It's a very cool guitar, and of course it was in candy apple red, the best color you can ever have a classic guitar in. And so again, it was a little overwhelming at first, but I quickly fell in love with the project that he had. I worked with him on some things, and this is actually the period where I started beginning the world for the novel that I just finished my first draft of a couple months ago. And I have him to thank for that. I have the presence of this stranger who I met at my guitar lessons and then who joined my little private school for a year. He's the reason that I started world building, and I am infinitely thankful for the time that I had with him. Well, inevitably, high school started the next year, and I didn't take any art classes. I actually stepped away from doing almost all extracurriculars too. I had played sports in middle school just in an effort to get to know the other kids. You know, I played soccer and track and basketball. I wasn't very good at most of them. I was proficient at soccer, but I was not very good. I am fairly athletic, but I just never cared enough to practice enough to be as good as the other kids. I would rather be playing video games and drawing and writing songs, so that's what I did. But what I fell into was a lot of engineering stuff in high school. I joined Odyssey of the Mind, which is a group where you basically have science-y problems and you solve them and you compete. I went to world finals my freshman and sophomore year, my first 2 years of high school. And the start of my sophomore year, second year of high school, I formed a band with a good friend of mine. And I proceeded to spend the next year or two playing concerts almost every weekend in little coffee shops and in bars that I was not old enough to get into, but my parents would sign off so I could do that, at festivals. It was awesome. I look back on that time with so much fondness. High school was so much fun. But art was not a big part of those first couple years. When I got to my junior year, I had realized that other people were not taking full loads of classes. I didn't know that was an option. They had study halls or open periods, and I did not. So when I got to my junior year, I had taken a ton of classes already, and I started to have free time in my schedule. So I did the only logical thing and started to sign up for painting and drawing classes. And it was wonderful. I was reinvigorated by the new video games at the time and reinvigorated by being in class with these other people who were building out and drawing wonderful, beautiful things. And the last 2 years of high school for me were basically centered on art. I think my senior year, I took 6 or 8 art classes, something crazy, like painting 2, drawing 3 and 4, AP Studio Art, both semesters, graphic design 1 and 2. I just took everything I could possibly fit into my schedule. And I fell back in love with art, and it was a wonderful thing. I had a chance in the engineering classes to work on 3D animation, which I loved the idea of, but I was never very good with. And this is also the time period where my father introduced me to a lovely little tool called Photoshop. Now, I had begun drawing on a drawing tablet when I was much younger. I forgot to mention that earlier, but even before we moved to Colorado, my dad had managed to get his hands on one of the first drawing tablets ever. Granted, we didn't have any good drawing programs, so we used MS Paint with it, but that was fine. But as I started to experiment with Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator, oh boy, we started to discover wonderful, crazy things. And this was the period where DeviantArt was starting to rear its head, probably a couple years prior to this. And so all of a sudden, we could see art from artists around the entire world. This is actually when I ran into Mark Brunet, who back then was under the alias of Blueflay. And he's here on YouTube. You can go find him now. But I ran into his work in like 2003, which is kind of crazy to think about. That's 21 years ago now that we were aware of his work. And so this was a wonderful period. I was exposed to what art could be. I had a lot of time that I was able to dedicate to art. And then something happened. I started to realize, like most people do at this point in their life, that high school and compulsory education are coming to their end. And at some point in the not too distant future, I was going to have to make some decisions about what I was going to do with my life. And I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified of what the next stage of life might be. I knew that I wanted to do something with art. I probably wanted to do something with music, but I was terrified of doing that because I didn't have any formal musical training. So I didn't want to go to school to be a musician because they would find out that I didn't know anything. And I knew in my younger mind, looking around at all the other artists, I was not good enough to just be a drawer or a painter. So I enrolled in one of the local schools, a college that was maybe 25, 30 minutes north of where my parents lived. I figured I could live at home, I could save some money, and I could go get a degree in drawing or a degree in animation or something. Now, keep in mind, this is just a normal state school. They did not have an animation program, but I didn't know these kinds of things. My father, trying to help me out, trying to give me some assistance, actually managed to track down a professional 3D animator in Denver. And he took me down to his house and had this guy just kind of walk me through the steps of what that would look like. And it was a really lovely thing for my father to do. But I don't think he understood how scary social interactions like that were, especially when I felt like I was out of my place and I felt a little stupid for the questions I was having to ask because I was uninformed. And so I actually came out of that interaction more terrified than ever to pursue this thing that I had kind of been excited about. So I took the easy route. I went to the college that was up the road, and originally I signed up for a drawing degree and a computer science degree. I felt some of the stress go away as I finished out my senior year. I finished all my art classes, and I graduated high school. And that summer was pretty relaxed and pretty chill. And then college started. So I went to CSU in Fort Collins, Colorado. It's Colorado State University. It's a pretty standard agricultural university. They have a decent art program, but it is not really what they do best. And little did I know when I started there that the art building was actually built during the 1 year in Colorado's history, or the couple years, where it was not required for them to put air conditioning units into the buildings. That law, of course, lasted a very short time before they realized that was a terrible idea, and they put AC units back in buildings. So that building was not very comfortable for a large portion of the year. It gets close to 90 degrees during the end of the school year and the beginning of the school year here in Colorado, and I had several times of taking summer classes where it can actually get over 100 degrees. But it meant that the building was it was too hot in summer. It was usually okay in winter, but circulation wasn't great. The ceiling always leaked when we had big rainstorms or big snowstorms. There would be just an array of buckets down the center of the building, catching all of the water that was leaking in. That said, it was kind of my home for a couple years, and I loved the fact that I could work in that building at any hour of the day, and I frequently did. I frequently would stay and work on projects till 1 or 2 in the morning, and it was a lot of fun. I started meeting a lot of other artists, and it was interesting to come from a school where I dressed different, held myself different, and was part of a small crowd to then go to a school with tons and tons of people who were kind of just like me. There was an element of, oh goodness, I was the punk rock kid and now I fit in. And then also a little bit of satisfaction and happiness in that this was the first time I was around people where I could dress weird, I could draw on my arms, I didn't get yelled at by teachers for sketching in class. It felt a little bit like a long lost home in some ways. The classes were not hard my freshman year, but remember, I was also a computer science student for at least the first semester, so I was taking programming as well, which was much harder than my art classes, but still kind of fun, still its own kind of thing. I realized pretty quickly after I started my classes there that the idea of getting a computer science degree and an art degree was going to be a lot of work, and also that it was not really going to help me with animation at all. Instead of adjusting course, I kind of just abandoned the computer science piece and finished out my first year of school as an art student. And that first year went pretty well. There was an issue, though. I discovered a video game that you might have heard of called World of Warcraft right after I finished my first year at college. And I really fell in love with the game and probably honestly became addicted to it. and started playing a gratuitous amount. This was also coupled with the fact that I moved out as I was heading into my second year of college, and I lived in a kind of dorm with a whole bunch of other folk and just a few minutes away from the college, which was awesome. It was lovely to be out of my parents' home and to be able to make all my own decisions and things. So, of course, I ate terribly, I slept terribly, I didn't show up to class on time, and I actually stepped away from art classes during my second year of college because I realized that I didn't really know what I was doing and I didn't really want to confront that. So I took all gen ed classes, just got my history and math and literature and composition, speech. I got all those classes out of the way my second year of college and played a lot of video games. This was actually the first time that I slept through an exam, and my first math test in college I accidentally slept through. I promptly went home and dropped the class and then had to find an online version to fit that. So there was not a lot of smart decisions made that year. I actually failed my first class that year too. I failed microbiology and ended up retaking it the next year because I didn't want to have a D on my report card, on my transcript actually is what it would have been. But I made some great friendships, some of which I still have today, but I did little in the pursuit of art. Looking back, it likely stems from a lack of direction. Many of the things I had relied upon, my parents, my religion, my education, old friendships, even the town I had grown up in, I departed from all of them, and I had to find traction upon the ice rink that I had created for myself. After the completion of that year, I reevaluated things and I found some new direction for my academic pursuits. I moved home and I refocused on my artwork and on academia. So, heading into my third year of college, I decided to declare a different major, a more specific art major, and that was graphic design. After a bunch of conversations with my dad, trying to sort out what I wanted to do, I probably had conversations with my mom as well, but I don't remember them for some reason. I had a lot of conversations with my dad, and he really wanted me to do something that made sense, something that I could use to pay bills. You guys might have been here as well, where your parents are supportive, and then they get to a kind of point where they're like, well, but we want you to have a real job and do real things. And so I declared for graphic design because that was kind of the most practical from my perspective. There are a lot of graphic designers out there back then, and there were places that I could work, and I could get a pretty normal job at some kind of company or marketing agency or something, and I would be safe. And that's what my dad wanted, and I really am a cautious person by nature, so that sounded all right to me as well. I got about a year into that plan, and at some point during that, I realized there was another potentially safe plan that I could pursue. Another career that I could pursue that would allow me to do artistic things. Maybe it would be a little bit less stressful, but would also be pretty practical. And that was art education. So I started looking at that, realized that a lot of the things between an art education degree and a graphic design degree would overlap pretty decently. And so I ended up declaring that as a major as well. So I had two different majors now. This also meant that I was going to have to make up some classes. My sophomore year was kind of a wash in some regards, but I also had added on an additional 25 or 30 credits that I had to figure out. So this meant that I was going to have to take another year. This started a 2-year period, my third and fourth years of college, where I got to do typography and illustration, metalsmithing, high-level painting and drawing classes. It was awesome. I was back into art classes pretty much full time. I was doing education classes. The first one was absolutely terrible, but after that, when I really got into having an art teacher and I got to go work in classrooms and things like that, it was awesome. So during this period, I got the first opportunities to teach. I got to teach a group of special needs adults at the college, which was wonderful and very humbling, very good for me. I got to go to a local middle school and start teaching art, just mostly as like an attendant to the teacher. I was just helping out, but I got to work with a student who was blind at that middle school. And that was a really pivotal moment for me in my art education career because I had to rethink everything about how I was teaching. We were working with clay, So at least it was something that was physical. But I was working with clay with a student who couldn't use their eyes. And so my conversations, the way I talked about things, the way I tried to help her, it was really, really humbling, and it was really good for me, and it put me on a good trajectory. I also got to work with a buddy of mine teaching kindergartners, and man, that is hard. If you teach kindergarten, you are a saint. It is one of the hardest grade levels to teach I have ever taught. It is the hardest. The next one would be 7th grade, but we can talk about that later at some point. Also, during this period, I started dating the woman that I would eventually marry. And we got married right before my 5th year of college began, which was awesome and lovely. But we got married in early August and then got back from our honeymoon, and it was pretty much straight into school. So trying to negotiate finishing my education with running a home and figuring out how to be married was a lot, but it also meant that I was spread thin in a good way. I didn't have a chance to really get into any kind of trouble or do anything stupid. I had a lot of work to do in a lot of aspects of my life, and I got it done. And it was not a bad first semester. I finished off my graphic design degree, and I got to have this awesome, terrifying experience at the end of that where I basically had to produce a thesis. I had to pull together 10 to 12 pieces and present them to a group of professional graphic designers. And this was, as you might assume, pretty scary, because if they looked at my work and didn't approve of me, if I didn't pass that, I actually didn't get the degree, and I would have to spend the next semester kind of revamping things and then attempt to do it again. Now, I hadn't heard any stories of somebody failing this, but it did exist as a possibility. And that was pretty triumphant and pretty awesome. It was also weird because a lot of the pieces that I was really happy with were ones that they didn't care for too much. And then one that was a piece where I designed my own typeface, they loved. They thought it was very intriguing. It was very cubist in the way it was put together and had a lot of colors and design elements of Russian constructivism, which is probably my favorite graphic design movement. But it was not a piece that I thought was going to get high marks and really did. So I finished that off. I did well. And then the next semester I went into my student teaching, which for those of you who don't know, to get a teaching license and degree here, at least in Colorado, and I think most of the United States, you have to spend a semester actually out in the classrooms teaching. And that was good, but very hard. The first part of it was working with elementary students, and elementary kids are difficult to work with. They are excited about everything, but I didn't do great. I did all right. The cooperating teacher that I had did not communicate with me very well, and frankly, I was young and didn't ask a lot of questions, and I was pretty dumb in how I did it as well. So I did okay. I think I got a B plus maybe, and then I spent the second half of the semester working with the high school students. And that was also very humbling. It was much more my speed. I did a much better job with it. At one point, though, my cooperating teacher there told me that I was too familiar with the students, that I was talking to them as if they were peers. And at that point, ironically, I think I was 23. So I was only a couple years older than some of these kids. In fact, I still had friends that were in, late high school or had just finished high school. And so that was a little bit of an adjustment too, to figure out that oh yeah, these aren't my friends, these are students, and to make that adjustment. And we saw that in the school that I worked in when we hired young teachers, especially teachers who were 22, 23, 24, they had a hard time with high school seniors because there's not a big age gap there. But I finished off that semester and I graduated. And so awesome. Now I have 2 art degrees, essentially, a BFA in graphic design and a BA in art education. And then I applied to schools and heard nothing back. And I applied, I think, to some graphic design positions and heard nothing back. And so I ended up just getting a job landscaping. It was the job that I could get. And it was hard. I reported to work at 5:30 in the morning. I worked with dangerous chemicals that got onto my body. And I have had some medical issues that we don't know if that's what they're tethered to, but there are some problems that I still have today. And there's a good chance that some of those are linked to the work that I did for this landscaping company that was run really unethically. And I was young and, early life as an adult and just got married and needed to make money. And so that's what I did for a little over a year. I worked landscaping. Now, during this period, I also had an opportunity to work on some random logo design stuff. My wife and I helped found and start a church, and I got to do the design for that and a lot of the early graphic design work for them and also the logo, which was really cool. I had a bunch of people in my life that hired me and paid me an exposure for doing graphic design work, which I'm sure all of you have heard of before as well. The quick, side note there, don't work for exposure. Always get yourself paid unless you're donating your services, but don't be taken advantage of. Artists are important. What we do is important, and you as a human being are important. So I actually had a lot of time to work on art because I would get home, I'd be done with work at about 2 or 3. My wife wouldn't get done for a couple more hours, so I would generally have a little bit of time to work on art. A lot of that time was graphic design. I don't remember painting or drawing during that year period much at all. And we actually, my best friend from growing up and I had an opportunity to work on a board game / card game. And we did not make much money from it, but it was a really good experience, kind of, again, terrifying, but we got to work on that, which was really cool. And then after about a year at this job, I threw my back out and they treated me really, really terrible. And I threw my back out doing stuff at work. They sent me out on a job by myself, which is not a good idea. And lifting the trailer gate down, I'm not a big dude, and threw my back out. And so I couldn't do a lot of work, and they wanted me to take it as all unpaid. And I was like, no, I got hurt on the job. This is not right. They treated me so bad that by the time I got healed, I started applying other places and eventually got another job working with trees, doing arbor work. And it was for a really good company that trained well. And I really was starting to think I wasn't going to be able to do anything with art ever. And so I spent a couple weeks at this new job and noticed that they had a really good pay scale that, for each certification you got, you would either get a $1 or $2 an hour raise, which back then, making about $12 or $13 an hour, $1 an hour raise was pretty substantial. And this was before the economy went to chaos like it is now. And so that looked like a pretty good trajectory. And part of that too was an entire division of this company was just analyzing and inspecting trees and learning about insects. And I love bugs and spent a huge portion of my youth working with them. And actually at one point contemplating becoming an entomologist, a bug scientist. And then out of the blue, my wife gets a message on Facebook from an old friend of ours, who was actually the wife of an old roommate of mine. And she asked if I was still looking for a job teaching. And it turns out she had started at a little charter school that was going to open in a couple weeks, and the art teacher that they had hired had just quit. And the school was supposed to open in 2 weeks. So I scrambled like a madman, trying to find old things and clean myself up and find good clothes. And I went and had this interview. And my interview was in someone's basement because they were still in the process of getting the school together and they didn't have their certification of occupancy or anything yet. And I went and had this interview in a basement and did pretty well. And I remember very distinctly at the end of that interview, the principal, the guy who was going to be my boss if I got this job, asked me, "Are you an expert in this field?" And I'm interviewing for a position to teach K through 8 art. And the question took me aback because I think that it would be pretty arrogant for me to say, yeah, of course, I'm an expert. I can do this. And so I paused for a moment and thought about it, told him I thought it was a good question, which is a great stalling tactic, right? The response that I gave him was, I don't know, but I can become one. And evidently that worked because the next day or the day after, I got a call and he told me that I had the job. Now I was out doing my arbor work at that point in time. I think I was actually out aerating lawns, and I finished the jobs that I had to do for the day, and I went back into the office a little bit early. And I went in and met with my boss. He wasn't my direct supervisor. He was actually the guy who was in charge of the entire facility there. And I gave him the whole story, and I apologized profusely, and he actually held up his hand and he interrupted me, and he said, "I knew it was just a matter of time." He's like, "You're too smart for this. I knew you would be out of here at some point." And then he told me that this is exactly what happened with his mother when he was growing up. That she got a chance to do a job, to get into a teaching job right before the school year started. Somebody else had quit. She had to quit last minute, and then she taught for 20 or 30 years. And he was just so sweet about it. And I felt so much better about this pretty awful thing from my perspective. I've just had this job for 5 to 7 weeks, and now I'm quitting, and you guys have been so lovely to me. And he made that bearable, and he made me not feel terrible about that. And he wished me well as I left. And then I believe that was a Friday. So Monday, I showed up as a teacher with 1 week before this brand new school would launch that nobody had. It was the first year, so nobody knew what they were doing. And I got to start a school. And this process, as you might imagine, was also a little bit crazy because, like I said, we did not have our CO. We could not even really get into the building yet. And I met for my first day of work in the basement of a bank in the tiny little rural town that I lived in because, again, we didn't have a place to meet. And we're all just kind of getting filled in on what this place is going to be. And it's all just vision casting because nobody's actually done anything yet. It was a classical charter school in this tiny little town. We just kind of brainstormed, and I learned so much and was taking notes profusely. And then a week later, we opened our doors. And I taught 7 classes a day, including kindergarten twice a week for that whole school year. And it was crazy. I think I worked 60 to 80 hour weeks. I had a 45 minute drive to work every morning. And I didn't, because I didn't work in the same town. And it was good. I would say it was awesome, but it was hard. But it felt satisfying. Everything we were doing was good. You know, I was learning so much. I was failing continually. Some of the students, had been homeschooled their whole life. A lot of them had been homeschooled their whole life. A lot of people had weird ideas about what the school was going to be. That first year was like a giant hiccup. But I learned so much. And I got to teach, I think we had 500 or 600 kids that year. I got to teach 500 to 600 kids art. And it was wonderful. And it really sustained me artistically for quite a while. Now, I didn't get a chance to teach 9th grade because we just didn't have enough room in the schedule. And the school only went to 9th grade the first year. We added 1 grade afterwards until we went all the way through high school. And I built an extracurricular class for the 3 9th graders that were interested in art, and we did a little extra art thing throughout that year. For me, I didn't get a chance to work on a ton of my own art because I was dedicating so much time to teaching and spending time learning from all of my other colleagues, many of whom had taught for years and had so much to teach me. It was really good for my humility as well, because this was one of the first times in my life where I was definitively the dumbest person in the room, the least experienced person in the room. And that was really good for me. I was kind of an arrogant kid. So being in a spot where I was looking around at this room and going, oh my goodness, I just need to shut up and listen to all these people, was a really, really good thing for me. And probably one of the most valuable things from that entire teaching experience. Now, that year was rough. We had some weird situations with the board of directors and with the school district. And I ended up putting in a lot of overtime work to try to help everything. That paid off though. Heading into the 2nd year of the school, I was actually promoted into administration. I was kind of a half vice principal, half teacher. So I taught 4 classes a day, and then I worked on administrative things. I handled all the subs, the aesthetics of the school, what it looked like, the website, all those kinds of things. I didn't necessarily do each of those pieces, but I managed them. And that year, I got to move into teaching middle and high school exclusively, which was lovely. And that's what I did for the next 10 years, including that one as a middle and high school teacher. Moving into middle and high school exclusively was really good for me because I have always been focused as a teacher on helping students grow. And this might sound really silly, but there are a lot of art teachers out there. And I'm not sure that this is a wrong way to do it, but there are a lot of art teachers out there whose specific goal is to help their kids have fun, or to find fun or joy in art. Especially in my early years of teaching, my goal was specifically to teach them how to make things, to teach them how to get better at art. Another portion of the curriculum was also specifically on art history. I kind of always fought this component because it's less interesting to me, but what I did was I would take units of art history, and then I would figure out a way that the students could actually make projects that were actually tied into those things specifically. So it was really good for me to be working with middle and high school students because I could push them a lot harder, and because frankly, all the high school students, it wasn't a required class for them. So if they were there, they wanted to get better. And my classes began to gain a reputation for being pretty tough, for it being pretty difficult to get an A in my classes. And I also had a pretty good track record of getting kids from little to no skill to much, much higher aptitude. And I think it's just how my brain works. I'm pretty good at dissecting things and understanding them. And I'm probably a much better teacher at art than I am actually at making art. And that was a little bit hard to wrap my head around because, of course, I have pride as an artist and want to be better and want to continually get better. Those next 2 years where I was in administration and also teaching were good, but very, very, very hard. And after 2 years of doing that, I stepped down and went back to just teaching. Unfortunately, this was also the year where we had some upheaval in the school. The lovely principal that I had had the opportunity to work under was not renewed for the next year, which he was not fired, but it was the political way for them to get him out of the building. And the next couple years were difficult because of that, because we went from being this place that was led by somebody who had a very, very strong vision to being led by good people who didn't have that exact same vision and who took a little bit of time to find what their vision was for the school. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it made that fourth year very, very difficult. But I was beginning to make some really good friends, people that I'd worked with for a long time. And I'm not going to go over every year. I taught at that school for 11 years. Many of the following years were pretty much the same. And the school became so large that we needed to build a new building. We needed to expand and have the middle school and high school on a different site. That was really exciting. I had a little bit of play with getting the room built the way that I wanted, most of which didn't really work out because schools don't have a glut of money. But I had my own space that was basically just my space. And I think maybe only one period a day a teacher taught in there other than me. And that was awesome. Having my own space was such a nice thing. And also not traveling between two sites every single day for teaching was great. I got to build an AP, which is an advanced placement program as well, which is really cool. I got to go do a couple day long conference and learn how to teach the classes and how they're put together. And that gives kids college credit if they do really well with the exam. So that was a really fun thing to do. It was also in this period of time where my wife and I adopted our little daughter. And we were very fortunate because we had probably the most positive set of interactions you could possibly have with her birth mother and the entire situation. And we adopted her from Texas, which is kind of lovely in a certain way because that's where I was born too. So we are both born in the same state. It also happened at the end of the school year. So I got to come back for just the last day of the school year and then go to summer and spend the entire summer with my wife and my new daughter. And that was wonderful. I had always expected that I would get to be a parent. I didn't expect it to be quite the journey that it was. And I knew that it would be a good thing. Like, I knew being a dad would be a good thing, but I just didn't expect it to be nearly as fun as it was. And it has been a ton of fun. That year had some big adjustments, trying to figure out how to go back to work and have a kid. But it also meant that a lot of the just BS of normal work was less of an issue because I'm like, I gotta go home. Like, I've got a kid. I gotta go take care of them. And that year went pretty smoothly. And then the pandemic hit. And for us as teachers, it hit during spring break. And so we just stayed home the rest of the school year, taught online. And that was pretty all right for me. I have my kid and my wife at home with me, and we live out in the country. And, this is okay. I don't think I left the property for like 30 days, and it was wonderful because I'm so introverted. And this was the first time in my life that I didn't have to go anywhere. I didn't have to interact with people except for the students that I was teaching, and most of the kids were pretty good anyway. So we got through the end of that. We got through the summer, which again was pretty all right. And then we went back to work in fall. And that year was really very strange and very hard because teaching during the pandemic for me as an art teacher basically meant that I did all my classes online and I watched the core subjects classrooms during the day twice. And so for 9 months of that school year, I did not have an opportunity to actually teach any kids in person. Not 9 months, sorry. 6 months of that school year. It was 2/3 of the school year. Right at the end of the school year, I got to have students back in person, and that was great. But that year was so tough psychologically because everything that was beneficial about teaching, working with the kids, getting to talk to them about what's going on in their life, help with the psychology of their creativity, all these wonderful things, these relationships that I built up over years, none of that could occur. And so it made that year soul crushing. Part of the way that I compensated for that is that I started to take classes again, and I started to focus on my own art. I set up a studio space for myself in the classroom, and I painted and I drew. And that was basically how I got through that year. That year finished out, we went into what would end up being my last year teaching. And that year was another one that was quite rough. We had a couple things happen with the family that were pretty difficult. We had a wildfire come through near us, and it destroyed my brother-in-law's home and destroyed a whole bunch of structures and stuff on my in-laws' place. And so they were unhomed for a while. They had to live in a hotel, and it was really, really rough. And my wife changed careers and all of a sudden was not able to help watch our daughter at all. And it was just chaos. And so at the end of that school year, I decided that I was going to get out of teaching after 11 years of putting my time into that. And it was a solemn affair. I knew that it was the decision that was right for my family and I, but it was not easy. It was hard to do. It was hard to step away from something. In some way, it felt like quitting. It felt like giving up. And I hated that notion. I hated that idea. And so I got out of teaching after 11 years of doing it. And for a time, I was just at home, taking care of the property, taking care of the home, taking care of my daughter, making sure that I remove as much from my wife's workload as I possibly could. And I needed some time to recover from that period of the last couple years of teaching. However, I am not very good at waiting, and I am not very good at sitting around and doing nothing. So in very short order, I built up a curriculum for myself. I was going to really hone my art skills. I was going to start working on these things. And I started just getting invested in these classes and all these things that I was going to do while I was kind of maintaining everything else in life. And I drew up plans for maybe someday starting to teach classes online or work for a little local graphic design firm or doing graphic design online. Maybe I could start a YouTube channel. That might be kind of cool. And then my wife got laid off of her new job, and we had this new little spot of chaos and crisis because I had just gotten out of teaching, and this awesome new job she had gotten was going away as well. Fortunately, she got a package out of that, a severance package, so we had a couple months to kind of sort things out. And that's actually where I scrapped my plans to start working on kind of long-term art stuff and decided, well, I'm going to start putting some of these things into effect now. And that was when I started working on all the prep work for the YouTube channel, and when I started learning how to record and when I started looking into those kinds of things. And then come the beginning of 2023, I opened the YouTube channel, and it did nothing for a very long time, because that's kind of how it goes, right? Like, YouTube kind of seems like it's going to be pretty easy, and it's not. It's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time unless you get lucky. And there is some strategy to a lot of it. There's a lot of strategy to it. But I also didn't really want to go about it in a way that was going to be really inauthentic or was going to be super clickbaity. And so I decided that I was going to do it the way that I was going to do it, and I was going to reevaluate constantly and be really patient and try to make things the way that I wanted to make them. And that went for a little while. But the best part about that entire thing is that it got me making art constantly and consistently, because I had to have art in order to have it on for the videos. And if you go back and you look at the videos at the beginning of this channel, the artwork is very different from the stuff that I produce today. And that's been one of the most beneficial things for me on my art journey, is that starting the YouTube channel and having things that I have to post weekly, and then up to twice a week, and then now 3 times a week, it means that I have to constantly produce things. And after doing that for maybe 6 months, 9 months, I fell into a routine, a really solid routine, and art finally locked back into place and became a consistent piece of my day-to-day and weekly life. And now, for the first time in ages, it really feels like it's an integral component of my life. I started writing a book in late 2023, probably in August or September. I had a friend of mine who is a literature teacher, invited me to come to a writing group. So I started finally putting pen to paper with that world building project that I started in 8th grade. And a month ago, as of the recording of this, I finished my first draft of that book. And I am now working on a children's book that has a character from that same universe. And I am in a little gallery here in town. And for the first time in basically my whole life, I feel like my art journey is coalescing into something. And it feels wonderful and terrifying and scary. And it's very, very exciting. And a lot of that really is tethered to the YouTube. Starting the YouTube channel really got me working consistently. And I don't know if you listening, if that's going to be your specific path, but social media, if you can keep it from burning your soul away, can be a wonderful trigger to push you into a place where you are held accountable and you are putting work out frequently. Because it turns out, if you're drawing 10 hours a week and you are just not playing video games anymore, or you're staying up late working on paintings and drawings, you will improve. Imagine that. And that's what I found. And I found a love for the work. And I started to finally find a style. And I'm probably getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the little gallery that I'm in. It's a little co-op in our tiny town, and we've got 19 artists in there, and each of us have radically different work. We work there 2 or 3 times a month, and we don't sell a whole lot there, but it is a lovely experience, and I'm meeting and learning from all these artists, and I'm paving the way for the future. And my future is going to continue to be here on this platform. I will probably start teaching some classes online again here pretty soon. And I'm going to start producing more work for sale. And maybe next year I'll start working at some farmers markets and things like that. But we'll see. Right now, I am just happy to report that my journey feels like it has finally coalesced into something. It is only now that I feel like I have a cohesive style for my paintings, a cohesive style for my drawings, and it has been a long journey. I am 37 years old at the recording of this, and to my knowledge, I started art about 34 years ago. So I record this, I put this together, not because I'm important, because I'm special, because I have an awesome journey and story to tell. I record this because I hope it will be encouraging to you, whoever you are that are listening, that your journey might be a long one too. That if you are in your 20s and you are where I am now, that you might be encouraged by the fact that you are moving faster than someone else. If you are older than me or you're at my age, to understand that it's taken a long time to get here and that's okay. But also that it really hasn't taken that many years of dedicated work to get here. And so if you are 30, 40, 50, 60 years old and you want to dedicate the next year or two solidly to working on an artistic pursuit, you can do that. And you can get somewhere where you are really, truly happy with your work and you're producing beautiful things. Because for me, I am finally producing things that I feel content with. Now, that lasts for a little bit of time because I always want to get better and I'm pretty hard on myself. But it's nice to report that things are in the best place they ever have been for me artistically. And so, at least for today, that is the story of my art journey. As always, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. This is a personal one, and this is a long podcast. So if you are still here, I really appreciate your time. And I would like you to comment below SpaghettiOs, just because it would be funny to put that, if you don't mind. Thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When for your continued support and for your help with the scripts sometimes and your feedback on podcasts like this. If you are looking to support the channel, you can do so through the Patreon link below. And you will get access to outlines and scripts for podcasts and sketchbooks early, and the chance to vote on things as well. If you are looking to join an artistic community where you can have other people who are like-minded to talk with and converse, and sometimes to rant to or to vent about life, you can check out the link to our Discord community below. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon. Maybe I'll do like one of these each year or something, like have a... Like, this is the update for my journey for this year. I don't know. Might be interesting.